Hey, do's and dudettes, it's me, Uncle Herbie, and this is another edition of Wisdom After the Fall. Today's subject matter is about diversity. Now, not DEI, I'm not getting into that. I'm getting into the simple question, or the answer to the question, or the response to the statement, depending on how you look at it. You can phrase this as a question or a statement. Is diversity our strength? You've heard people on both sides of the aisle give this speech many, many, many times. You don't need me to give it too. I've said it actually, but I said it almost as an afterthought. I saw President Obama say it. I've seen President Trump say it. I've seen President Clinton give a very famous speech about it. But the consistency on both parties and all politicians, in the mainstream anyway, is that diversity is our strength. So that made me start to think, is it really? Is diversity our strength? Or are we all just saying it? I mean, it wouldn't be very hard if someone were to dig into my background to find out that I've said it more times than I can count. I used to be in favor of almost unlimited immigration of people that were qualified to be here, not, give me your, well, anyway, don't send me your prison population like the Mariel boat lift. Let's just say that. But I've since mellowed some of those. If your mind doesn't change with new data, there's something wrong with you. And so I'm starting to re-examine the question, is diversity our strength? Now, a lot of people assume that we must be the most diverse country in the world because of all the different races and countries of people that live here. But we are not. In fact, we are not in the top five. All five of the top countries, well, 4 out of 5 are in Africa. And I'm going to turn my head to the side because it's on my computer screen, which is to my side. And they are Uganda, Liberia, Madagascar, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the fifth one rounding out the list is Papua New Guinea. All of those countries are more ethnically and ethnically and culturally, I was the word I was looking for, diverse than the United States. Not necessarily racially diverse, but that's only one kind of diversity. In this country, people we break ourselves down. I've noticed in the black community, and particularly when I was in prison, the lighter blacks caught a little crap from the darker, well, not a little, a lot of crap from the people who were darker, just based on how much, I guess, melanin is in their skin tone. And in Africa, we don't have to go too deep to find out that people who are uniformly black have been slaughtering each other in those countries and virtually every African country for a very long time. So clearly, ethnic diversity, at least in Africa, has not been a strength. Now, in our own hemisphere, Brazil is more diverse than the United States. How's it working for them? Not too terribly well. A lot of people don't know that at the time of slavery, most of the slaves that came into the Western Hemisphere did not go to America. Of the roughly 11 million slaves that came into the Western Hemisphere during the entire period of time that the West was, well, the Western powers, the colonial powers, were importing slaves into this hemisphere, into the Americas, let's say, of the roughly 11 million, only about 450,000 came to the United States. All the black people who here in the United States now who can trace their heritage and their lineage all the way back to slave times were part of those 450,000 at some point that came over from Africa. The other 10.5 million went to the Caribbean islands and South America, and the overwhelming portion of them went to Brazil. And Brazil has enormous ethnic and cultural problems. Brazil is not the country we want to be imitating. God knows. Now, I don't want to make things simplistic and say that all of Brazil's problems are due to diversity. They're not. The United States is a uniquely blessed country, and we have a lot of geographic advantages that other countries don't have. And we have, for example, we have 2 major oceans. We have lots and lots of usable ports. We have the Mississippi River system, which is unique in the world, a navigable river running north to south of the entire country and spanning off into tributaries to the sides that makes moving goods and services before the industrial age ever came really, really easy. So building the infrastructure of the United States, which was much simpler than anywhere else in the world, really, even European countries. So we have a lot of structural advantages, but the question back on this topic is diversity our strength? And the answer is yes and no. I think the answer is yes and no. Yes, it's our strength because we have diversity of thought. One of the things that, for example, going into this age of AI, and I'm going to do a whole video on AI soon, But there are a lot of people that are really, what's the right word? And maybe it's you, terrified of what's coming with AI. There's no need to be terrified, and there's really no choice because AI, frankly, and this is a slight digression, but AI will be the only thing that saves us from financial collapse. Our debt is unsupportable with the shrinking population that we have, and immigration didn't do it. I mean, you could make the argument that we need to import people through immigration in order to make up the terrible birth rate, but it's not going to work. And looking at how immigration's been going here and in Europe, taking people from countries that want to come here may not be the best thing we could possibly do. So the only thing we can do in order to pay down our national debt and get it under control before we end up in a hyperinflation, again, I'm going to discuss that another day. I did discuss it a little bit in yesterday's video that completely flopped on the true story of Robin Hood that nobody watched. I guess, I don't know. You try, it's a new station. But the bottom line here is by increasing productivity and increasing output would increase tax revenue. Each worker, on behalf of his company and himself, would be producing much more goods and services, producing much more revenue, producing much more taxes, and giving the government much more with which to control the national debt and get things down to where they are manageable. I will tell you one more thing about that, and then I'm going to move on with diversity. And that is, there has never been a case in the history of the world, in the history of civilization, when national debt went over 100%, that the result wasn't hyperinflation sooner than later. And our national debt is 135%, okay, of our GDP. Okay, we're at 135% of GDP. I don't know what I said before, 100% of national assets, is that what I said? It's of GDP. We're at 135% of GDP. And we can't sustain it. It's a guaranteed disaster. And as bad as we are, the whole globe is in it. And the one thing that could save us all from this experiment in paper, fiat, made up money that the entire world is participating in and now run themselves up into massive debt is AI. Elon Musk says that AI is going to make it all go away. And I think he's right, maybe, but not if we get in its way. So back on the subject matter at hand, one of the great advantages, the AI horse is out of the barn. Pardon me, Senator Sanders, but we're not going to take a pause. That would be a suicide for the country because not only must we be a part of the AI revolution, we must lead the AI revolution in order for us to maintain the dollar as the world's reserve currency, because if we lose the reserve status, it's game, set, match, and the country is over. So we're not going to pause it. What we can do is maintain our lead. We have an enormous lead in AI technology, not in data processing centers, which we are quickly trying to remedy despite people making false objections. Another subject for another day. However, what we have an enormous advantage of is intellectual power. We still patent more than any other country in the world. The country in second place, by the way, is Israel, which goes to show you don't need to have a lot of population or population diversity in order to be very inventive. But here in the United States, we have such a diversity, such an ethnic diversity, such a cultural diversity, and every culture and ethnicity thinks a different way. So in competing with the Chinese, what the Chinese are in most Asian countries, in fact, I can't think of the exception off the top of my head, they're great perfecters. They are not inventors. Okay, you don't look to Asia for where the great inventions come. You look to Asia for where the great perfection of inventions come. So the Chinese make EVs, but they didn't invent EVs. That's pretty simplistic. But if you look at everything the Chinese produce, they didn't invent any of it. And all the improvements they've made are simply either by stealing technology from us or from other countries, because they're constantly looking to steal technology. And why are they looking to do that? Because the Asian culture doesn't invent. It's a conformist culture. It's so strong in respect of family and values and age and seniority and position that it builds up a block to invention. Okay, yes, the Chinese culture invented gunpowder, and yes, the Chinese culture has done many, many great things, but it's also stagnated for very long periods of time, and it's because of this Asian tendency to not invent but perfect and then dig in, okay, to tradition. They're very tradition oriented. Where but we have, but they do, we want perfecters. We want to make our products better. So the fact that we have lots and lots of Asian engineers here, and what's really interesting is when you take an Asian out, and we'll get, this is going to be the core point of this presentation, and you put them here, something magical happens and they become inventors. Okay, when you take the respectful Asian out of the culture and bring them here to the Wild West of the United States, what they retain and what they pick up creates this magical mix. That's why the head of Google is Asian. You know, it's not a great big, you know, mystery. You know, it's just something magical happens here. And what happens here, what has always happened here until recently, is the melting pot. Okay, we have forgotten that term, the melting pot. America's strength is diversity of thought because it helps us in our competitive edge. That one example that I just beat the death out of, but there's lots more. We have people, Germans, Italians, Jews, Asians, everybody together, Africans, thinking all in different ways culturally, looking for different solutions to different problems. You know, if you look in the animal kingdom, you look at pods of orcas, which is the other unbelievably intelligent creature on this planet, maybe even human intelligent, but that's another story for another day. But they don't have hands and thumbs, so they can't build anything. But the point is that they've learned that most of what orcas learn, you know, different orcas predate on different things. Some on fish, some on marine mammals, some on sharks. You know, it's all different. And how do they develop a taste, and how do they learn, and why does one? Because it's learned behavior, not inherited behavior. These aren't genetic things. The orcas literally teach their young to do different things depending on where the pod of orcas are and what the primary food source is, and other things that orcas have to contend with environmentally in order to survive. And by the way, it's a matrilineal culture, which is really interesting. It's a female-dominated culture. Female orcas live twice as long as male orcas. But anyway, that's probably the just desserts of God on another species. Wouldn't it be great if God was an orca? Then again, why would have God made us to pick on orcas? I don't know. Anyway, that was just a thought that came into my head. Anyway, so we keep going down. So it's great that we have this diversity, but our real strength was forcing everybody into a common culture, was the melting pot. And it was forcing. I myself am only second generation. My grandparents on both sides, on my mother's and father's sides, all came from what used to be the Soviet Union at the time that Russia fell and then became the Soviet Union. Most of them came right at the time of the Russian Revolution. They were fleeing the persecution of the Tsar, and they didn't believe in the socialism of the Bolsheviks, and they wanted to get out of Dodge. And they all came here, and none of them spoke word one of English. Some of them on my father's side spoke Yiddish and Russian. Some on my mother's side, it was just Russian. It was not a religious family. They were Jewish, but more secular. But when they all came here, they had to learn English, and there was no English as language classes for Russian immigrants. They just had to dive in and do it. And the very fact that they had to dive in to do it, and there was no second official language, and there was no accommodation for them whatsoever, is the great strength of America. It's not unfair. It's our strength. So today, when Spanish-speaking people come in, or Somali-speaking people come in, or Arabic-speaking people come in, or whatever the language might be or the culture, we have forgotten that we used to force people to conform to the common American culture. The Italians had to learn to speak English. They came here not speaking word one. The Germans had to learn to speak English. They came here not speaking word one. The Russian Jews, pick your nationality. Until the end of the 20th century, the very end, and now the 21st century, and in particular this over-fascination with diversity for diversity's sake, which is really a fancy term for tribalism. We are tribalizing a society. We're trying to turn our entire continent into Africa. It's absolutely insane. And that has nothing to do with race. It has to do with tribalism. Okay, the Africans constantly slaughter each other. All the countries that I named earlier are all countries where slaughter takes place routinely. Okay, I might be exaggerating a little bit, but not by much. Is that what we want here? Because that's what we're getting. Because we somehow have gotten into our thick heads that it's strong to maintain these cultural differences instead of ditch them. We didn't do, for example, the American Indians any favor. Native Americans, American Indians, call them what you want. Let's not get hung up. That's part of that too. Call them what you want. We didn't do them any favors by not assimilating them. We did something that we get no credit for. We're the first victorious culture, and when I say we, the traditional American culture, as I said, I'm second generation. I wasn't part of any of this. My genes had nothing to do with it, but I'm proud of it. But what we did was, as a culture, when we conquered the American Indians, who were in fact the Stone Age people, they had no written language, they had not invented the wheel, they had no carts, they had no mechanization, they had no tools beyond stone. Okay, no metal whatsoever, no fabrication, nothing. Okay, they were going to be conquered. They were conquering each other. They were lucky it was us because we're the only culture, the Western, I'm saying, culture in the world, and only really English Western culture, the British Empire in particular. Boy, are they lucky that the British won out over the Spanish, because the Spanish record and what they did to native peoples down south is not nearly as good as our record and what we did with our native peoples here, which is give them reservations. Who ever heard of giving the losers land? Okay, now you can say the land was inferior, it's land that nobody wanted, but there are plenty of wealthy Indian tribes today that might argue that with you. I don't know. It's not a debate I get heavily into, but I would make that case. But whether I did or I didn't, who gave any land to a losing culture? Can you think of another instance in history where the winner said, hey, you know what? We feel bad about us taking, your land. By the way, they didn't have a deed to it. They were just wandering nomadic Stone Age tribes on a wide open continent that routinely slaughtered and conquered each other. 60 years before Sitting Bull killed Custer at Little Bighorn, the Sioux had killed another tribe, I think it was the Cheyenne, to throw them off the exact same land, to take it as their land. I mean, there was nothing new about empire. The Comanches had an empire that ran from central Mexico into Kansas in the United States, and they were the last really great Indian tribe. I love Indian history as far as that goes. But the bottom line is that we are unique in how kindly we treated them, but we ended up, the road to hell is paved with good intentions by isolating them on the reservations. And I can tell you this because I'm very active in these kind of charities. I have been over the years, not at this moment, but over the years. My number one favorite charity was juvenile diabetes, which is rampant on the Indian reservations because the tribes that are here in Arizona have an obesity situation. I can't speak to the whole country, but I think because the desert tribes out here learned to live on much less calories and evolved to live on much fewer calories, having to subsist in a much harder environment than, let's say, the Massachusetts Indians. That's literally the name of the tribe, not the state. I mean, it is the name of the state, but they named it after a tribe. Or, Connecticut, or, all the other Indian tribes up there, Iroquois, and they had a land of plenty. I just the other day rewatched Last of the Mohicans, which was, I'd forgotten what a terrific movie that was, and it really holds up. I strongly recommend it. But anyway, it was abundant. Out in the desert, they learned to live on very little. So when the white man came and put them on the reservation and made sure they had plenty of food to eat, they all got wildly fat. And then they stayed in the reservation. And I'm being broadly general, but you can come out here and see it with your own eyes. Obesity is out of control on the Tohono O'odham reservation. I think they used to be called Pueblos or Navajos. But out here, we don't use that anymore. We use Tohono O'odham. Anyway, we didn't do them any favors, okay? We just didn't. I realize there are a lot of American Indians that would scream and yell now that it's their land, and I'm not trying to make the case that we should take it away now. That horse is out of the barn. Not at all. I'm just pointing out that diversity is only a strength when the people that are coming into the culture are forced to conform to a common culture. Canada's biggest problem has to do with bilingualism and the fact that they have to deal with French and English on everything. Okay, here in the United States, we're only a step away accommodating Spanish. Now look, yo hablo español. Okay, I speak Spanish. I lived in Mexico for nearly 6 years. I did business in Mexico. Fui un hombre de negocios en Mexico por 6 años. I love Mexico. I love Latin culture. I grew up in Miami. I spoke Spanish before English because we had a Cuban housekeeper and my mother was divorced. I'm all about it, but it shouldn't be an official language. There should not be bilingual forms. There should not be bilingual signs, and no accommodation should be made because we're not doing the immigrants any favors. We're basically consigning them to be permanent, envious shit kickers. Okay, without speaking English, they're never going to work in any serious position in the United States. They're basically going to shovel shit, metaphorically speaking, for the rest of their life, and they're not going to be happy about it, which is why, again, if you lived here, for example, in Phoenix, you'll meet plenty of Mexican Americans who don't speak word one of Spanish, who have completely assimilated into the culture. Now, look, I'm not saying you shouldn't speak Spanish. I speak Spanish, as I said. I also speak Russian, but I didn't learn Russian from my grandparents. I learned it at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. The only Russian I heard at home growing up was a little children's song that it got repeated so many times by my mothers and my mother and my aunts and everything that it really made no sense. I've sort of tried to piece it out. It went Bozhe, ma Bozhe, что ты пересет. But it's right away it starts not making sense. And I mean, Bozhe, my Bozhe is God, my God. Что ты пьер, what now? But then it just turned into gibberish because it just got repeated so often and there was no meaning to it. The point I'm making is we didn't speak it at home. We're not doing anyone any favors. Diversity is our strength intellectually, but it will be our downfall culturally if we don't get it through our thick heads that to come to the United States, regardless of where you come from, means to conform. Conformity to the common culture. It doesn't mean conformity of thought. It means that when you're in public and how you behave is governed by a common culture. Okay? And to the point that you deviate from that is to the point that you guarantee your own failure. I mean, this is a dramatic example, but do you think if you were an employer here in your city, okay, and two young black men walk in to interview for the same position, and they're both intelligent, and they both have a lot on the ball, but one of them is wearing their pants down to their knees and their ass is hanging out, and the other one comes in a shirt and tie and looks you in the eye and answers the questions, which one are you going to hire? Okay, that's all. Now, that's a dramatic example, but the fact of the matter is, you don't have to go very far. I was an employer. People don't have the foggiest notion how to conform to the culture, and it's gotten only worse. So, in wrapping up today's show, here's what I want to say. America, stop encouraging diversity. Encourage conformity of culture. You want to go home and play diverse? Great. You want to go home and dress up in whatever the native garb is from whatever continent your people come from? Knock yourself out. No one loves a good, for example, Greek festival more than me. Okay, I'm just saying you can do all that stuff. No one's saying don't do it. And God knows we want you to keep the way you think culturally because that is our strength. But you got to play ball in the traditional way. You've got to look, dress, feel, speak, respect, and interact with your fellow Americans in a common way because we have lost that. And if we don't reclaim it, we are in big, big trouble. No machine in the world is going to save us from ourselves. That's all I have to say for today. I want to thank you very, very much for joining me. Please like, subscribe, share, and do all those other good things. And I'm not going to pitch anything today. I'm just going to say thank you for joining me. Please, please pass it. I just need to get to 1,000 subscribers to monetize, and then, lots of new abilities. The videos get better. I don't want to beg, plead, and cajole, but I've noticed that most of these guys beg, plead, and cajole, so I'll do a little bit of it and ask you to please. Anyway, but of course I saved this to the end of a 22-minute video, so most of you weren't watching it anyway. Anyway, I love this stuff. Have a beautiful day and peace out. This is your Uncle Herbie.